I want to start this deep dive with a memory.
Oh, yeah, the museum story.
Yeah, exactly. And, to be clear, right up front for you listening, this isn't some verified historical claim or like a grand academic thesis. It's actually a firsthand memory compiled directly from the personal notes of the researcher who put together our source material for today.
Right, but it paints such a specific picture that we really absolutely need to start with it.
It does. So picture this. If you are, listening to this on your commute right now or maybe doing the dishes, just pause for a second and visualize this space.
Right.
You are standing in the great halls of Mexico City's National Museum of Anthropology. It is this overwhelming, cavernous space. And right in front of you is the sunstone.
Yeah, the famous one.
It is a massive, deeply carved basalt disc. It spans about 12 feet across, and it weighs 24 tons.
The physical presence of that object, I mean, it's just staggering. When you stand in front of it, you aren't just looking at a piece of art. You are looking at like a localized anomaly in gravity. It just completely commands the room.
And right near it is the Koyosaki monolith, which is another massive carved stone, equally intricate. And the researcher noted that standing there, looking at these objects, what really strikes you isn't just the intricate mythology.
Right.
It isn't just the beauty of the artwork or, the terrifying nature of the gods depicted. It is the sheer volume of specialist human labor locked into that stone.
That's the real weight of it.
Exactly. Think about the physical mechanics of this for a second. We are talking about the pre-Columbian Americas. There are no beasts of burden here.
No oxen, no horses.
Right. There are no wheeled carts either. Someone had to literally locate a 24-ton block of basalt. Someone had to quarry it using stone tools.
Because they didn't have iron or steel for this.
Right. And then they had to move it miles using human muscle, ropes, and wooden rollers. Then someone else had to design the intricate, mathematically precise iconography.
Which is a whole other skill set.
And then a team of highly trained carvers spent years, literally years of their fleeting human lives doing nothing but hitting a rock with another rock to cut that image.
Which, really brings up the fundamental economic problem of monumental architecture.
Which is what?
Well, a 24-ton carved basalt disc contains 0 calories.
Right. Yeah, you cannot eat it.
You can't eat it. It provides no shelter. It does not help you survive the winter.
Right.
While those master carvers were spending years of their lives perfecting, say, the jaw of the sun god, they were not growing corn.
They weren't hunting. They weren't fishing.
Exactly.
So they had to be fed.
They had to be fed, they had to be housed, they had to be clothed, and their tools had to be supplied by an entirely different group of people.
People they would likely never even meet.
Right. An object like the sunstone isn't something a society just throws together in its spare time on a long weekend.
Definitely not.
Monumental architecture, complex astronomy, intricate art. All of these things only exist when a society has fundamentally, systematically solved the problem of daily survival for a massive chunk of its population.
Which perfectly brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today. We are asking a very simple question with a really mind-bending answer. What fed the hands that carved ancient history's greatest monuments?
It's the ultimate question.
We are looking at a stack of sources today that present a profound thesis. The thesis is that abundance is fundamentally an energy and resource surplus.
Yes.
When a society produces vastly more food than it strictly needs to keep its people alive, it buys free time. And historically, human beings reliably convert that free time into breathtaking cultural capital.
But, and this is a big but, as we are going to explore today, they also reliably convert it into brutal empires and rigid social hierarchies.
Right. It is the ultimate double-edged sword of human civilization. A caloric surplus is an engine. And to understand how that engine gets built, we have an incredible roadmap today.
We really do. We are going to examine what was arguably the most biologically productive farm in the pre-industrial world.
We are talking about the Aztec chinampas system in the Valley of Mexico.
Yep.
We're going to spend a lot of time unpacking the actual engineering of how a high-altitude swamp was transformed into the breadbasket of a massive empire. Then we will compare that to the engineering of the Maya down in the tropical lowlands.
Which is a fascinating parallel.
Oh, absolutely. And we are going to confront the very dark realities of what this agricultural surplus actually funded in the Aztec world. And finally, we will ask if these ancient zero fossil energy methods could hold the key to solving modern urban food scarcity.
But the journey really has to start with the dirt in the water.
Right, the basics.
Because before a society can dedicate thousands of hours to carving a stone dedicated to the sun, it first has to completely conquer its geography.
So let's get into the geography then. We're moving out of the museum and into the shallow lakes of the Valley of Mexico in the 1400s.
Okay, setting the scene.
We are sitting at over 2,200 meters above sea level. For anyone keeping track, that is roughly 7,200 feet.
Which is high. The air is thinner up there.
It's a high-altitude, chilly basin, completely surrounded by mountains. And the hydrology here is incredibly specific.
Extremely specific.
You have a massive chain of shallow lakes. The largest, the central lake, is Lake Texcoco. But there's a huge problem with Lake Texcoco if you want to grow food.
Yeah, it's brackish.
Right. It is essentially too salty for large-scale agriculture.
And the reason for that salt is geological. The Valley of Mexico is what we call an endorheic basin.
Okay, what does that mean?
That basically means it is a closed drainage basin. Water from all the surrounding mountains flows down into the valley, but there is no river taking that water out to the ocean.
Ah, I see.
It just pools in the lowest point, which happens to be Lake Texcoco.
So it's trapped.
Exactly. Over thousands of years, water flows in, the sun evaporates the water, and all the minerals and salts that were carried down from the mountains are just left behind. It becomes a giant salt sink.
Okay, so you have a giant, useless, salty lake in the middle of this valley. But our sources note that the southern lakes in this connected chain, specifically Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco, were different.
Because they sat at a slightly higher elevation within the basin, and crucially, they were fed directly by massive subterranean freshwater springs.
Oh, wow. So they were getting clean water from underneath?
Yes. So the fresh water would well up in Xochimilco and Chalco, and it would slowly flow downhill into the salty bowl of Texcoco.
God.
You had this natural but very, very fragile gradient of water quality.
And here's where the people we commonly refer to today as the Aztecs and their neighboring city-states did something absolutely audacious.
It really did.
They didn't look at this salty swamp and say, well, I guess we'll just farm the edges where the water is good.
No, that wasn't enough for them.
They decided to physically rewrite the hydrology of an entire basin. They built enormous dikes and causeways right across the open water to physically wall off the salty water of Lake Texcoco from the fresh water of the southern lakes.
The scale of this public works project is it's difficult to overstate.
Tell me about it.
The most famous of these is the Dike of Nezahualcóyotl, built in the mid-1400s. We are talking about an embankment that was roughly 16 kilometers, so about 10 miles long.
10 miles.
10 miles,
Yeah.
and it was built straight through the lake.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Because whenever I read a history book that says they built a dike, my brain just kind of glosses over it.
Right, it sounds simple on paper.
Exactly. But how do you build a 10-mile wall in the middle of a lake without heavy machinery? I mean, you can't just dump dirt in the water. It'll just dissolve and wash away.
You can't. You have to build it in very careful stages, and you have to use a composite of material.
How'd they do it?
Well, they would start by driving 2 parallel rows of heavy timber stakes deep into the lake bed.
Okay.
This creates a sort of wooden corridor in the water. Then they would fill the space between those wooden walls with heavy volcanic rubble and massive stones.
To give it mass.
Yes, to give it mass and anchor it so the currents wouldn't push it over.
So it's basically a massive 10-mile-long wooden trench filled with rocks. But rocks are porous. Water, especially salty water, would just seep right through the gaps in the rubble. How does that separate the fresh water from the salt water?
That is where the clay comes in. After all the rubble is laid down, they pack the core and the sides of this structure with massive, massive amounts of clay and earth, effectively creating an impermeable seal.
Oh, wow.
They physically blocked the osmosis of the salt water.
That's incredible.
And it gets better
Yeah.
because they controlled the sluice gates in this dike so they could actually manage the water levels.
Like a modern dam.
Very much so. When the heavy rainy season hit, they could open the gates to prevent the freshwater lakes from flooding the cities. During the dry season, they closed them to maintain the water level for the farms.
They essentially created a colossal, artificially managed freshwater safe zone.
Yes. It is an engineering feat that, frankly, rivals the aqueducts of Rome. But instead of moving water to a city, they were terraforming a lake to build a farm.
Right. So inside this massive, walled-off freshwater zone, they built the chinampas. And I really want to pause here to correct a pervasive, popular misconception.
Yes. I know what you're going to say.
If you have ever heard of the Aztecs, you have probably heard the phrase floating gardens. The image is usually these, like, rafts of woven reeds floating around the lake with corn growing on them.
Which is completely wrong.
Right. They weren't floating rafts at all.
No, that is a very romantic translation of the concept, likely stemming from early Spanish accounts trying to describe something they had literally never seen before, but it is entirely inaccurate.
So what are they?
Chinampas are anchored, raised beds. They are artificial islands built from the lake bed up. They do not float.
Because if they floated, the root systems of the crops would lack stability, right? And a strong wind would blow your entire corn harvest across the lake.
Exactly. It makes no agronomic sense to have a floating farm.
So how exactly did they build them? Because again, the mechanics of building a solid island out of mud seem impossible.
Well, the farmer, the chinampero, would stake out a narrow rectangle in the shallow lake bed.
How narrow? Our sources say these were usually 2 to 4 meters wide, right?
Yeah, quite narrow, but incredibly long, like 20 to 40 meters long, just these long, thin strips of water.
Okay.
The narrow width is the most critical design feature of the entire system, which we will get to when we talk about water physics. But to build it, they used a technique somewhat similar to the dikes.
Okay.
They would drive wooden stakes into the lake bed to outline that long rectangle. Then they would weave branches, reeds, and vines between the stakes.
Almost like creating a sort of underwater basket or a fence.
Yes, an underwater corral.
Okay, so you have a woven rectangular fence sticking out of the shallow water.
Then the grueling labor begins. They would take canoes and use long poles with baskets on the end to dredge up the rich, dark, anaerobic muck from the very bottom of the lake.
That sounds exhausting.
It was incredibly labor-intensive. They would dump this muck inside the woven fence, then they would add a layer of tangled mats of water weeds and tule reeds.
So it is mud, then vegetation, then they dredge up more lake sediment, then more vegetation.
Exactly. They just keep stacking these alternating layers. It creates a highly porous, incredibly nutrient-dense artificial soil profile.
How high do they go?
They would keep stacking this until the solid bed stood perhaps half a meter to a meter above the actual water line.
But as you pointed out earlier with the dikes, if you just pile mud in a lake, water erosion will eventually eat it away. The woven fence isn't enough to hold it forever.
Right. The wood will rot over time.
Exactly.
So the finishing touch, which is an absolute stroke of ecological genius, was planting native willows around the very edges of this new island, specifically a tree called the Ahwehoti willow.
Okay, I am struggling to picture how a tree saves an island of mud. I mean, I plant trees in my yard, and the soil still washes away in a heavy rain. What makes this specific willow so important?
The Ahwehoti willow grows incredibly fast, straight up like a column, and it does not branch out wildly so it doesn't cast too much shade over the crops.
Which is important for corn.
Very, but the magic is really underground. Its root system is exceptionally dense and aggressive, and it absolutely loves water.
Okay.
The roots would grow straight down through the layers of dredged mud, through the woven fence, and anchor deep into the solid lake bed below.
Oh. So the tree acts like living rebar in a concrete foundation.
That is a perfect functional analogy. The roots knit the artificial porous soil together permanently. It anchors the whole plot so it cannot wash away.
That's brilliant.
And, as a bonus, the line of willows acts as a windbreak, protecting the delicate crops from high-altitude gusts, and their canopy provides just enough shade to keep the water in the canals from evaporating too quickly under the intense Mexican sun.
So let's talk about those canals. Because once you build hundreds and then thousands of these long, narrow rectangular islands, you are left with a massive grid of narrow waterways between them.
Right, a whole network.
And these canals weren't just for paddling around in canoes, though obviously having a boat-accessible farm is an incredibly efficient transport network. You don't need carts.
It's very efficient.
But the canals themselves were actually the secret engine of the farm, right?
They were. The canals served three critical simultaneous functions. They were the irrigation system, the drainage system, and the continuous fertilizer factory.
Wow.
It is a masterpiece of a closed nutrient loop.
Let's break those down, starting with irrigation. Because if I have a traditional farm, I have to wait for rain, or I have to dig a ditch from a river, bucket the water out, and pour it over the top of my plants.
Which is backbreaking work.
Right. But the chinamperos almost never watered their crops from above.
No, because they utilized physics. This is why the beds had to be so narrow, only 2 to 4 meters wide.
Why?
If you build the bed just a short distance above the water level, the water from the surrounding canals will literally wick up into the porous organic soil from below.
Really?
Yes. It defies gravity through a process called capillary action.
It's exactly like dipping the corner of a paper towel into a spill on your kitchen counter.
Yeah.
You watch the water climb upward, fighting gravity, soaking the paper towel.
Precisely the same mechanism. The soil is the paper towel.
So the roots are just pulling it up.
The roots of the crops are constantly, perfectly sub-irrigated. They draw exactly the moisture they need, and because the water is coming from below, you lose almost zero water to surface evaporation.
That's incredible. That solves the water problem completely. But what about the nutrient cycle? Because every gardener knows that if you grow corn in the same dirt year after year, the corn sucks all the nitrogen and nutrients out of the soil.
It strips it bare.
Right. Eventually, the dirt is dead and nothing will grow.
Well, in almost every other pre-industrial agricultural system on Earth, from medieval Europe to ancient China, you farm a piece of land until it is exhausted, and then you have to let it lie fallow.
You just don't plant anything.
You have to leave it empty and unplanted for a year or more, so nature can slowly replenish the nutrients. The chinampa system essentially eliminated the fallow period entirely.
How? Where are the nutrients coming from if they never stop growing?
From the canals.
The canals again.
Yes. Those narrow waterways were constantly collecting organic matter. The leaves falling from the willows, dead water weeds, fish waste, and the runoff from the incredibly nutrient-dense lake.
Okay.
And crucially, as the island city of Tenochtitlan exploded in population, human waste from the city was systematically collected in canoes and brought out to the chinampas.
Wait, they were bringing night soil human waste from a city of hundreds of thousands of people out to the farms.
It was a highly organized civic system.
Wow.
Instead of letting waste create disease in the urban center, it was monetized and utilized as a resource. The Chinamparo would take their canoe, scoop down into the bottom of the canal, and dredge up this thick, black, decomposing organic sludge.
And then what?
They would haul it up and slather it directly on top of the garden beds.
So they're taking all this rich, decaying sludge and just continuously rebuilding the topsoil.
Exactly. They are manually closing the ecological loop. The plants pull nutrients up. The plant matter and waste fall into the water. It decomposes into sludge. The farmer pulls the sludge back up to the top.
That is brilliant.
The soil was never exhausted because it was continuously being replaced with material that was richer than what was there before.
That is just a masterpiece of landscape engineering. You have a self-watering, self-fertilizing island.
Yeah.
But having great dirt is only half the battle, right?
Right.
To get the mind-boggling agricultural surplus that built the Aztec Empire, they had to maximize time. They had to ensure that the land was producing calories every single possible day of the year.
And this brings us to the agricultural strategy that supercharged the entire operation.
Let's dig into that.
It is a technique that shifted the Chinampa from merely a highly efficient farm into a relentless biological engine of production. We are talking about the seedbed, known as the chapines.
Okay, let's walk through this carefully because this kind of blew my mind when I read the sources.
It's very clever.
In normal farming, you harvest your crop of corn, you clear the field, you plant a new seed in the dirt, you wait a week or two for it to sprout, and then you wait months for it to grow.
Yeah.
For those first few weeks, the field is basically just empty dirt doing nothing. But the Chinampros didn't accept that downtime.
They absolutely refused to let the main plot sit idle. Instead, a Chinamparo would designate a very small area at the edge of the Chinampa as a nursery.
Okay.
They would scoop up that incredibly fertile, sticky canal mud and spread it out into a thick layer. Then, using a knife or a specialized stick, they would slice that mud into a grid of small blocks. The chapines.
Think of them as individual organic nursery pots.
Exactly. And they would press a single seed into each little mud cube.
Okay.
And those seeds would germinate and grow into hardy seedlings in this concentrated nursery bed. And here's the crucial part. They are doing this while the main Chinampa plot is still completely full of the previous crop approaching harvest.
Wait, so rather than planting a field and waiting, this is essentially an organic assembly line.
Yes.
The next crop is already fully sprouted and on the conveyor belt before the current crop is even out of the ground.
It is the ultimate optimization of space and time. The absolute second a bed of maize or beans was harvested, the Chinamperos would move in.
And what do?
They would physically pick up those individual mud blocks containing the healthy, established seedlings from the nursery and transplant them straight into the newly cleared soil.
Oh, wow. So the ground was literally never idle. It never had an empty day.
Never. Because the climate in the Valley of Mexico allowed for year-round growing. They didn't have a hard winter freeze that shut down biology. This transplanting trick allowed for a staggered, constantly overlapping rotation of crops.
What exactly do we mean by rotation here? Are they just planting corn over and over?
Oh, no. And that is another crucial element. They were practicing polyculture.
Polyculture.
Right. They would cycle through a massive variety of crops. You would have fast-growing leafy greens, herbs, chilies, tomatoes, and amaranth.
Okay.
And then you had the heavy caloric hitters, the traditional Mesoamerican milpa trio, maize, beans, and squash.
And the milpa is important because of the nitrogen cycle, right?
Exactly. The maize pulls heavy nitrogen from the soil. The beans, which are legumes, have symbiotic bacteria on their roots that actually pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it back into the soil.
Which feeds the corn.
Yes, and the broad squash leaves act as a living mulch, shading the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. The plants were practically engineering the soil chemistry for each other.
So because they had this conveyor belt of seedlings and a year-round growing season in perfect self-watering soil, we arrive at the most famous and maybe the most debated statistic about the chinampas.
I know exactly where you were going.
The claim that they could achieve 7 harvests a year.
Yes, we must treat that number with extreme academic caution. It is heavily debated among scholars.
Why is it debated?
When agronomists look at the claim of up to 7 harvests, they view it as an absolute upper bound, a theoretical maximum potential for specific, very fast-growing crops like radishes or leafy greens in a perfectly managed plot.
Right. It is not a settled trivia fact that every single inch of the valley was pumping out 7 distinct crops of massive ears of corn annually. I mean, corn takes months to grow.
Right. You can't rush the biology of corn. It is a range. But the reality is, even if we aggressively discount that maximum number, let's say they only achieved 3 or 4 harvests of major caloric staples on average, the output of this system remains absolutely staggering in the context of world history.
How staggering are we talking?
Our sources indicate that a single hectare of well-managed chinampa could feed 15 to 20 people for a whole year.
Wow. I want to frame that for you listening because numbers like that can just kind of wash over you. How does feeding 15 to 20 people per hectare compare to what was happening in Europe at the exact same time? Say around the year 1450 or 1500.
It vastly, wildly outperforms it. Contemporary European broadcast farming of wheat or barley was incredibly labor-intensive in a very different way.
How so?
It required massive amounts of land, it was highly vulnerable to slight changes in weather or rainfall, and the soil exhausted quickly.
Right, because they didn't have the closed loop.
Exactly. A European farm might feed 2 to 4 people per hectare in a good year. The chinampas were hyper-concentrated caloric engines operating at, multiples of European efficiency.
So let's extrapolate this efficiency. By around the year 1500, shortly before the Spanish arrived, researchers estimate there were roughly 10,000 hectares of chinampa spread across the managed freshwater zones of the lake basin.
That's a massive area.
It is. And this massive churning agricultural factory was feeding Tenochtitlan, the island capital of the Aztec Empire. Now, population estimates for Tenochtitlan are also debated, but most modern historians land somewhere around 200,000 people living in the city itself.
Which made it one of the largest, most densely populated urban centers on the entire planet at the time.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It was significantly larger than London, larger than Paris or Madrid at the exact same time.
And here is the kicker. They built a city of 200,000 people on an island, in a lake, at 2,200 meters elevation, because the basic existential human problem of how do we get enough calories today so we don't starve was effectively solved.
That is the crux of the abundance thesis our sources are arguing.
Okay.
When a society solves the calorie problem to this profound degree, it alters the trajectory of human capital. People are no longer tied to the digging stick.
This raises a massive question for me, though. Was this surplus to culture pipeline just a fluke? I mean, was it just a one-off stroke of luck because the Mexica happened to find a shallow lake and figure out the willow tree trick? Or is this a predictable, repeatable pattern of human civilization?
To answer this, our sources point us south. We have to look at the Maya.
Okay, let's go there.
It is a vital comparison, because centuries earlier, roughly spanning the classic period between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya civilization ran the exact same equation.
But they did it in a completely different, in many ways, much more hostile environment.
Right.
If you picture the Valley of Mexico, it's a high-altitude, chilly lake basin. The Maya were operating in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize.
Yeah, we were talking about dense, steamy jungle canopy,
Ah.
brutal seasonal rains, followed by intense dry seasons.
And thin, easily depleted tropical soils. Yet they pulled off a similar hydraulic miracle.
They did. They didn't build chinampas in the way the Aztecs did. The geography just wouldn't allow it. But they engineered their own massive hydraulic landscapes.
What do they do?
They built extensive agricultural terraces into the hillsides to capture soil and water. And in the massive seasonal wetlands, which are called the bahars, they built raised field systems and complex canal networks that are really only now being fully understood.
And the reason we are only understanding them now is one of the coolest technological developments in archaeology today.
Oh, yes. The lasers.
We are using lasers.
We're talking about LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging.
Wait, I know it involves planes and lasers, but how does it actually show us farms that have been buried under a jungle for 1,000 years?
Yeah.
I mean, the jungle is incredibly thick.
It's fascinating. An aircraft flies over the dense jungle canopy, firing millions of laser pulses down at the ground every single second.
Okay.
Now, most of those laser pulses hit the top of the trees and bounce back, but a tiny fraction of a percent of those light pulses will slip through the leaves, slip through the branches, and hit the actual ground before bouncing back to the sensor.
So the computer just filters out everything that hit a tree, and you were left with a naked 3D topographical map of the forest floor.
Exactly. And the LiDAR maps have completely revolutionized Maya archaeology in just the last decade.
What did they find?
They show that what we previously thought was just vast stretches of impenetrable, untouched jungle was actually a highly managed, intensively engineered agricultural landscape.
Right.
The Maya were manipulating water flow on a staggering scale. They were digging huge reservoirs to hold water through the dry season. They were draining swamps and raising massive planting beds above the floodlines.
So despite the entirely different climate and entirely different methods, the result was exactly the same.
The same equation.
The intensive wetland farming of the Maya created a massive caloric surplus. They had more food than the farmers could eat. Yeah. And just like in Tenochtitlan, that surplus fed a pipeline. It funded a non-farming elite.
Yes. And if we look at the results of that surplus, the similarities in the cultural explosion are just undeniable.
Let's talk about those achievements.
Yeah.
Our sources highlight 3 specific areas where the Maya surplus funded full-time specialists.
Okay.
First, writing. They developed the most advanced writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. The text describes it as a fully developed logosyllabic script.
Right.
Stop right there.
Yeah.
What does logosyllabic mean? How is that different from, the alphabet I type on my phone?
Our modern English alphabet is phonetic, right? The letters represent individual sounds, not concepts.
Sure.
On the other hand, a pure logographic system, like early Chinese characters, uses single symbols to represent entire words or whole concepts.
Okay, I follow.
The Maya genius was combining them. They had symbols that represented entire words, logograms, but they also had a complete separate set of symbols that represented phonetic syllables.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they could spell out words phonetically, or they could use a single picture concept, or they could blend them together in the same sentence. It allowed them to record highly complex histories, poetry, and political propaganda with the exact same nuance and grammar as spoken language.
And you only get the time to invent a grammatical puzzle like that if you have a silo full of extra corn.
That is the rule of surplus.
So the second area was mathematics and timekeeping. It funded the mathematicians who developed the long count calendar. I've always heard the Maya calendars were complex, but what makes the long count mathematically impressive?
Well, for one, the Maya independently developed the concept of zero as a mathematical placeholder long before it was widely used in Europe.
That's a huge conceptual leap.
It is. They used a base 20, or vigesimal accounting system, and their timekeeping was essentially a system of interlocking years.
How so?
They had a 260-day sacred calendar perfectly interlocking with a 365-day solar calendar. The long count was their linear calendar, designed to track vast spans of time from a mythological creation date.
So they weren't just tracking seasons.
No, it allowed them to calculate dates thousands of years into the past and future with pinpoint accuracy.
Which leads perfectly into the third area,
Uh-huh.
astronomy. Because you don't build a calendar like that without staring at the sky.
You don't. They had full-time, state-funded astronomers who were tracking the cycles of Venus, predicting solar and lunar eclipses with terrifying accuracy, and aligning their massive stone temples to the solstices.
They were mapping the cosmos because they weren't tied to a digging stick in a swamp. It's an incredible, universal, underlying rule of human civilization. It absolutely does not matter if you are in a high-altitude brackish lake in Mexico or a dense, steamy tropical forest in Guatemala.
The environment changes, but the rule doesn't.
Right. If you figure out the water engineering, you secure a surplus. The surplus buys free time. And human beings reliably, predictably turn free time into math, stars, and writing.
It is a profound realization. Abundance is the strict, non-negotiable prerequisite for societal complexity.
So let's carry that realization back north. Let's return to Tenochtitlan at its height. We have this island city of 200,000 people, absolutely flush with calories from the chinampa system.
Okay.
What exactly does a city of that size look like when a massive chunk of its population is completely freed from the daily grind of farming?
It looks like extreme specialization.
Right.
The chinampa surplus allowed the Mexica to develop a deeply stratified, highly specialized professional class. We are not just talking about a king and some farmers. We're talking about deep layers of society.
Give me a sense of the professions. Who is eating the surplus?
Well, you have full-time priesthoods dedicated to specific deities. You have scribes, that's like Huelo, whose entire lives were dedicated to painting folding bark paper and deerskin books called codices.
Like keeping records?
Yeah, recording genealogies, taxes, and histories. You had master feather workers who created iridescent headdresses and shields from quetzal feathers.
Wow.
You had goldsmiths, architects, the engineers who maintained the very dikes and aqueducts that made the city possible. You had a class of long-distance merchants called the Pasteca, who traveled hundreds of miles on foot to trade luxury goods and act as state spies.
Spies.
Yes. And, vitally important to the empire, a massive standing warrior class.
Let's focus on the cultural capital this specialization produced. We mentioned the museum in our cold open. Let's talk about the context of those massive stones. They sat at the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple.
The heart of the city.
Right. This was a monumental, towering twin pyramid located at the dead center of the island city, the sacred precinct of the empire.
And its dedication perfectly encapsulates their worldview. The twin shrines at the very top were dedicated to two specific gods.
Who were they?
One was Huitzilopochtli, the patron god of the Mexica, the god of war and the sun. The other was Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and agriculture.
Blood and water, war and agriculture, the two pillars of their existence. And this massive pyramid wasn't just built once and finished, was it?
No, it was built, and then as the empire grew richer, it was expanded and built over entirely.
Well, like encased.
Yes, it was constructed in massive, successive layers, almost like Russian nesting dolls, by full-time architectural specialists and highly organized, fully fed labor crews.
And sitting at the base of this towering structure was the Xochimilco monolith, the massive stone we mentioned earlier. It was discovered relatively recently, in 1978, by electrical workers digging right in the heart of modern Mexico City.
That was an incredible find.
And it depicts a dismembered woman.
It depicts the moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui. It tells the foundational myth of the Mexica.
What's the myth?
The story goes that Coyolxauhqui attempted to kill her mother, Cotlicu. But Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, sprang from his mother's womb fully armed, defended his mother, killed his sister Coyolxauhqui, dismembered her, and threw her body down a mountain.
That is intense.
It is. And the placement of the stone at the bottom of the pyramid meant that when sacrificial victims were cast down the steps, they were physically reenacting this cosmic myth.
And again, we have to emphasize the stark material reality of these creations. The Coyolxauhqui stone, the 24-ton sunstone, you cannot eat them.
No.
You cannot eat the painted bark paper of the codices. You cannot eat a sophisticated dual calendar system.
No, you cannot. They exist entirely, solely, because the society was wealthy enough in calories to feed the people whose only job was to make them.
Right.
The mud of the chinampas bought the leisure time required to calculate the exact orbital mechanics of the sun.
Okay, I have to step in here and push back a little.
Go for it.
Because when we use words like abundance, surplus, and free time, it sounds incredibly utopian. It sounds like this beautiful, enlightened paradise.
I see where you're going.
But isn't this system deeply, inherently hierarchical? The people digging the rotting human waste out of the canals, the chinampas, they aren't the ones sitting in the clean temple studying the stars.
No, they are not.
Right, so the surplus creates breathtaking art, yes, but it also creates strict, impassable social classes. It creates a massive, violent gulf between the person growing the food and the person wearing the gold.
That is the crucial, unavoidable shadow side of the abundance thesis. And if we are going to understand history, we really must test this thesis honestly.
We have to.
The caloric surplus did not miraculously make the Mexica gentle artists living in an egalitarian paradise.
Not at all.
It gave them capacity. It gave them power. And power, capacity, in a historical sense, is entirely morally neutral.
Right, and they pointed that massive capacity at some very dark things.
They did.
The political structure we commonly call the Aztec Empire was actually the Triple Alliance. It was Tenochtitlan, allied with two neighboring cities, Texcoco and Tlacopan, formed in 1428.
And the Triple Alliance was not a benevolent welfare state sharing its chinampa harvest with the world.
Definitely not.
Not in the slightest. It was a highly aggressive, expansionist, militarized tribute empire.
Okay.
The exact same agricultural engine that fed the master sculptors and the astronomers also fed a standing army.
Because soldiers don't farm either.
Exactly. They used their immense caloric advantage to project force and conquer neighboring peoples all across Mesoamerica. And they did this primarily to extract wealth.
They were demanding tribute.
Yeah.
If you look at the tribute rolls in the surviving codices, they weren't just demanding corn. They were demanding luxury and power.
They wanted the best of everything.
They demanded gold dust, jade, raw cacao beans, elaborate featherwork shields, thousands of woven cotton blankets, and sheer human labor. The abundance at home fueled a brutal engine of extraction abroad.
And that brings us to the altar. Because the state religion of the empire included ritual killing, primarily of the war captives taken during those expansionist military campaigns.
Now, this is an area of history that requires extreme care. For you listening, we are going to handle this factually, because this topic is heavily contested, deeply politicized historically, and often horribly sensationalized.
We really have to tread carefully and follow the evidence.
We have to clearly separate the propaganda written by the Spanish conquerors from the hard reality of the archaeological record.
Let us address that gap directly, because our sources highlight a massive discrepancy.
What's the discrepancy?
When the Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, arrived in 1519, and when the friars later wrote their accounts, they claimed astronomical, horrifying numbers regarding human sacrifice.
Right. For example, they wrote that during the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, under the ruler Ahuitzotl, tens of thousands of people were sacrificed in a matter of days.
Some accounts claim 80,000 people were killed in 4 days.
80,000. And they reported seeing wooden skull racks in the city plaza holding hundreds of thousands of skulls.
And if we look at those claims logically, purely as a math and logistics problem,
Right.
the numbers fall apart completely.
They just don't add up.
To physically execute 80,000 people in 4 days would require killing people at a rate of roughly 14 people every single minute, nonstop, day and night, for 96 hours.
Without a break.
Without a break. It is a physical, logistical impossibility to move that many bodies up and down a pyramid. The numbers are frankly absurd.
So why did the Spanish write them down as fact?
Because the Spanish had a profound, vested legal and moral interest in exaggerating these claims.
To justify the conquest?
Exactly, to provide the moral framework for empire.
Okay, explain that.
Well, portraying the Mexica as an empire of unimaginable, demonic, bloodthirsty monsters provided the theological and legal justification to the Spanish crown and the Pope for the brutal military conquest.
It excused everything they did.
Yes. It excused the complete destruction of the city, the enslavement of the population, and their forced conversion to Christianity. The numbers were intentionally inflated to serve a colonial agenda.
However, our sources make it very clear that we cannot let the Spanish exaggerations push us into historical denialism.
Right, we can't swing too far the other way.
Just because the Spanish lied about the scale does not mean the practice didn't happen. Because when archaeologists actually dug into the center of modern Mexico City, they found the physical evidence.
They did. Starting around 2015, major excavations near the ruins of the Templo Mayor uncovered the Huid Zompantli.
What is that?
This was the Great Skull Rack, and the adjacent cylindrical towers that were built out of actual human skulls mortared together with lime.
And what did the archaeology actually show?
It showed a sobering, undeniable reality. They found hundreds of real human skulls.
Hundreds.
Hundreds. They found the skulls of men, mostly young men of fighting age, but also women and some children. The physical presence of these skulls completely refutes the six-figure propaganda of the conquistadors. The racks simply were not big enough to hold 100,000 skulls.
The Spanish were definitely lying about the scale.
Yes, but it simultaneously confirms that organized, large-scale, state-sponsored ritual killing genuinely happened.
The modern scholarly consensus, based on this hard physical evidence, suggests a debated range. They estimate the numbers were likely in the low thousands per year across the entire empire.
Which is horrifying to modern sensibilities, obviously.
Of course.
But it is a far cry from the sensationalist, physically impossible accounts designed to justify genocide.
What is vital for our understanding of the abundance thesis is the mechanics of this system. Human sacrifice on this scale, even the lower realistic scale, was an institution.
It was.
It was structured, it was bureaucratic, and it was incredibly resource-intensive.
Yes. It takes enormous wealth to house, feed, transport, and guard thousands of captives just to sacrifice them.
It's a really profound, if deeply uncomfortable, realization. If you are listening to this, think about how we usually view abundance. We think of abundance as the end goal, right? A utopia.
Yeah, we tend to think that if everyone just has enough food, if the economy is perfectly efficient, society will naturally become peaceful and perfect.
But the history of the chinampas surplus shows that surplus is really just a battery.
It is a raw power source.
Right. It powers whatever cultural machine the society plugs it into. It powers a telescope, mapping the stars. It powers a chisel, carving the sunstone. And it powers a sword, conquering a neighbor for tribute.
The rotting mud of the chinampas paid for the gorgeous poetry of the scribes and the blood on the steps of the Templo Mayor with the exact same currency.
Abundance is not inherently good or evil. It is simply the removal of biological limits.
So the limits were removed, the empire flourished, and then the empire fell.
The Spanish return after being driven out. They ally with tens of thousands of indigenous enemies of the Aztecs, and they besiege Tenochtitlan in 1521. The city falls.
It falls hard.
And over the subsequent centuries, the colonial Spanish government, and later the post-colonial Mexican governments, make a series of devastating ecological choices.
They really did. They did not understand or value the delicate hydraulic engineering that made the valley a breadbasket.
They saw water as an obstacle to European-style urban expansion and horseback travel.
Exactly. So they systematically drained the lakes, they broke the dikes.
They turned a brilliant, managed wetland into dry, dusty land.
Which ironically led to centuries of severe flooding problems and caused modern Mexico City to literally sink into the dry lake bed, a problem they are still fighting today.
But miraculously, the chinampa system refused to entirely die.
The biology was too resilient, and the local knowledge was too deeply rooted.
And this brings our story all the way into the present day. We are looking at the modern echo of this ancient technology.
Right.
If you go to the far south of the sprawling, concrete, smoggy expanse of modern Mexico City today, a remnant of the original freshwater lake system survives.
The canals of Xochimilco.
Yes, Xochimilco. If you've seen pictures of it, it's famous for the brightly painted tourist boats, the trejineras. But beyond the tourist routes, the chinampas are still there.
They are. You can still find the modern chinampero actively preserving this traditional craft.
They're still out there working the mud.
Still cutting through the narrow canals in canoes.
Still planting the archaeological willows and dredging the weeds to build the soil.
They are producing incredibly high-yield organic food inside the borders of one of the most densely populated, concrete-heavy urban areas on planet Earth.
The system is so remarkably resilient that in 2017, the United Nations officially recognized the chinampas of Xochimilco as a globally important agricultural heritage system.
It's a huge deal.
But what is truly fascinating to me, based on our sources, is that modern agronomists and urban planners aren't just looking at Xochimilco as a quaint historical curiosity.
No, they aren't looking at it as just a living museum. They are studying it as a highly sophisticated blueprint for our future.
Because modern global civilization is facing a massive looming crisis regarding urban food scarcity and the severe environmental impact of how we grow our calories.
We have to feed megacities of 20 or 30 million people.
And right now, modern megacities rely on a food system that is dangerously dependent on fossil fuels, We use petroleum-based chemical fertilizers.
We use massive diesel-powered mechanized pumps to irrigate fields that probably shouldn't be farmed in the first place.
And we rely on global fossil fuel-burning transportation networks to bring food from distant, exhausted farms into the concrete jungle.
And sitting right in front of us is this ancient water-based farming technique that is a perfectly closed loop system.
The chinampas fed a massive metropolis historically without a single drop of synthetic chemical fertilizer.
They do it without any mechanized pumps for irrigation.
And crucially, they did it with zero fossil energy.
As city planners look to drastically reduce the carbon footprints of modern megacities, the core biological principles of the chinampa are, frankly, revolutionary.
But I do have to ask a practical question about scale and application here.
Sure.
We are talking about a very specific technique that relies on intense, manual, human labor-like dredging mud by hand and a very specific shallow lake ecology.
True.
Can modern planners actually adapt a 600-year-old mud and willow technique to feed a modern concrete jungle like New York or Tokyo? Or are we just romanticizing the past? Because I cannot imagine we are going to flood downtown Manhattan and plant willows in the financial district.
That is exactly the right challenge to raise. They aren't trying to literally recreate the lake of Xochimilco in the middle of a modern downtown. What urban planners and agronomists are adapting are the underlying mechanical and agronomic principles.
Okay, so how do you extract the principle from the mud?
It is about creating hyperlocal, closed nutrient loops in urban environments.
Give me an example.
For example, modern urban planners are looking at how to utilize passive capillary irrigation, that paper towel effect we talked about, in raised beds on rooftops or abandoned lots.
Oh, I see.
Perhaps using modern permeable materials but mimicking the exact hydrology of the chinampa so you don't waste water.
And what about the fertilizer?
They are studying how to safely compost massive amounts of urban organic waste and cycle it directly back into high-yield, hyperlocal community farms, mimicking the canal dredging.
So it is about taking the biological efficiency of the Afuihoti root system, the physics of capillary action, and the logic of the closed-loop fertilizer cycle, and applying that to modern urban farming initiatives.
Exactly. Even advanced, high-tech hydroponic setups are studying how the chinampas maintain nutrient balance without synthetic inputs.
The logic of the chinampa holds the key. The modern chinamperos of Xochimilco are the living custodians of an incredibly advanced, highly sustainable agricultural science.
They are preserving the knowledge of how to create extreme abundance without planetary extraction.
Which feels like the perfect place to pull all of these threads together.
I agree.
We started in a quiet museum looking at a 24-ton rock, the Sunstone, and we traced the immense human labor required to carve that stone back to a high-altitude, salty swamp.
We saw how the Mexica and their neighbors used dikes, stakes, woven reeds, and the living roots of the willow tree to engineer an incredibly hostile environment into a managed freshwater breadbasket.
We saw how the genius of the closed nutrient loop, utilizing capillary action and recycled waste, combined with the staggered seedbed rotation of the chapines, unlocked a massive caloric surplus.
It fed hundreds of thousands of people and completely eliminated the need for a massive percentage of the population to ever work the land.
And we saw the pipeline that surplus created. Just like the Maya in the tropical lowlands using their raised fields to fund complex logosyllabic writing and calendars, the Mexica used their freed time to build a staggering cultural legacy.
Monumental twin pyramids, complex base 20 mathematics, astronomy, and beautiful art.
But we also faced the historical shadow of that abundance.
We did.
That exact same caloric battery powered a massive militarized tribute empire that subjugated its neighbors.
And it fueled a state religion that institutionalized ritual human sacrifice on a scale that, while greatly exaggerated by colonial propaganda, was undeniably brutal.
The history of the chinampa proves that surplus does not dictate morality.
It just buys human time.
The abundance is morally neutral. It is up to the society to decide where to point the engine. And that leaves us with a really profound question to close on.
A question for you, listening.
As modern technology, artificial intelligence, and new energy paradigms promise us a new age of abundance, our own high-tech version of a 7-harvest chinampa history leaves us with a critical warning.
What's the warning?
The problem isn't just about figuring out the engineering to get enough. The real problem is, once we finally secure that surplus, what exactly are you and I going to choose to build with it?